It is my great pleasure to welcome you to our grand finale, I would say, of this talk series for this year, Michele Diaz. Michelle's CV, when you read it, basically the message you get is that when she comes to a place, people don't want her to leave, I think, is basically the message. So Michele did her undergraduate degree at Penn State and then went on to do a PhD at Duke. She then as assistant and associate director of imaging in the imaging center there. And then Penn State decided that they missed her so much that they had her back, and she joined the faculty there as director of human imaging and as an associate professor in psychology and linguistics. So Michelle's research, as you'll hear today, focuses on a lot of topics, but among them age-related changes in language, kind of across the levels of language processing. This is a really important question, if only for its ubiquity. We are all getting older, right? So this is a question that touches all of us, hopefully. And it's really fundamental to our understanding also of other disease processes that affect the aging population. So I think you'll appreciate that angle on the work. I've come to appreciate Michele because we're both members of the Outcome Study section, entering the same class, although she's graduating before I am. And Michele is really remarkable in the study section for sort of her clear opinions and fairness. So it's been really fun to hang out there. Yes. All right, Michele Diaz.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a lovely visit so far, and it's great, always nice to come and meet new people and talk about research and kind of see what everybody's up to. So today I'm going to tell you a little bit about the work I've been doing on aging and language production. So we have a return. Many options for advancing. So I kind of divided the talk into 3 sections. I'll talk a little bit about background and aging in speech. In my case, I typically am talking about language production. That's what I focus on. I know there's a lot of speech comprehension research being done here, but we've been focusing on production for some reasons I'll tell you about. And then I'll talk about some studies that we've done recently that look at potential mechanisms that might be underlying age-related difficulties in language production, and I'll end with some conclusions. Very broadly, my research is interested in language production, our ability to make and produce speech, also aging, and then the neural infrastructure that kind of supports both of those things. It supports language production and maybe also has some age-related decline in that sense. And why am I interested in aging? Individuals over the age of 65 are the largest growing demographic. And you can see this in a recent census data where we have actual data from 2012, percentages of the population across different age segments of the life, and then projections. So kind of conservative to less conservative projections for what it'll be like in 2050. And what you can see for most of the groups is that they're either pretty stable or they maybe are even declining a little bit. But for the 65 and older group, they are increasing in large numbers. And that's, you can see that also in this other graph from the Census Bureau as well, kind of our population demographics from the 1960 versus our projections for what the population demographics are going to be like in 2060. And you can see a number of different things. So first of all, people are just living longer, right? So it was very unusual to live past 80, but now large segments of the population are just living longer. But then also fewer kids are being born. So you don't have as large of an increase on these kind of base levels of the pyramid, which is really no longer a pyramid. So just kind of this larger percentage of the population that's going to be over 60. And we'll need, so we're living longer, but we're not always, helping people live better and live more independently has huge societal and financial implications for us. So what I focus on is speech production, and the reason that I focus on speech production is that this is something that older adults tend to complain about. And these tip of the tongue phenomenon for sure, or word retrieval difficulties, word retrieval kind of slowness in your ability to retrieve words, or circumlocutions. You want to say a particular word, but you'll settle for something else because it's just not coming fast enough. We know these aren't memory problems. So sometimes people think tip of the tongue, oh, I'm getting Alzheimer's disease, but it's not a memory problem because the word is there, right? It's in your brain. It just comes to you, you know, an hour after it's useful, but it's there. And I'm really interested in language in general because, in particular with aging, because language is a combination of both stability and decline. So this is a pretty famous graph from Denise Hart's group that looks at cross-sectional data and in terms of cognitive abilities. And what you see are all these sad green and blue and gray lines that are kind of going down, down, down. And it's true, you know, as we get older, we tend to get slower in terms of our memory retrieval or speed of processing, lots of executive function abilities. But one of the things about language is it's an area, at least some areas of language have relative stability. So these are all measures of vocabulary, but if you did any kind of semantic judgments or antonyms, synonyms, tasks like that, you would see this kind of increase both in the size of the vocabulary or at a minimum stability across the lifespan. So in general, older adults have more diverse lexicons. They have a more in-depth knowledge on topics. And this could be a real, is one of the benefits, I think, of aging. But as I mentioned, it's a mixed bag. So not everything is maintaining in language production. And particularly what we see are these increased word finding failures, slower speech, increased number of pauses, all of which kind of point to lexical retrieval challenges or difficulties. So one of the models that's been proposed to account for some of these difficulties is Debbie Burke's transmission deficit model, which is really focused on language production. But the basic idea, it's a node structure theory where they basically hypothesize that phonological systems are organized differently from semantic systems, with the semantic systems being much more interconnected than the phonological systems having sparser representations. And so as we age, you might have weakening across the network, but those kinds of declines are going to be particularly damaging to the phonological system. So their hypothesis really is that a lot of these language production difficulties are phonologically based. So that's one hypothesis about where these deficits might be coming from. Another hypothesis in terms of the aging, kind of broader aging literature is relates to inhibition deficits. And the idea that executive function declines over the lifespan is not particularly controversial. So I think it's pretty well documented that, say, older adults perform slower on a Stroop task or take longer on a Trails task. But what I'm interested in is whether these kinds of executive function declines are really underlying the language production deficits that we see for older adults. The neuroimaging and aging literature broadly pretty commonly finds that older adults tend to recruit more brain regions if you give them really any kind of task. So this is some of the first aging studies that just looked at simple word recognition, word paired cued recall, word stem cued recall, face recognition. So this is not exclusive to language by any means. But what they see pretty consistently is that younger adults tend to have a more unilateral pattern of activation, particularly in these frontal regions, whereas older adults tend to have more bilateral representation or activation. So this finding of increased activation that kind of correlates with age is not so controversial, but the big area of dispute is what's the purpose of this increase in activation. So there's been some evidence that it represents compensation, so people who are able to upregulate to perform better on tasks, whereas there's also been a lot of research that should suggest that there is just a lot of upregulation of neural activity that doesn't have strong ties to behavior or is even associated with poor behavioral performance. And so that would be more of a de-differentiation kind of neural account.
Yeah, just try to follow those two.
Yeah, if you have any questions.
Yeah, because it feels like the argument about compensation shouldn't be an argument about whether it's helpful or not. In other words, it's just a question of difficulty, right? So the increase could be difficulty, and the difficulty being, for some people, having more activation means they're able to solve that difficult problem. Others they don't, but the difficulty and compensation are exactly the same thing, right?
Right. Yeah.
So was the first alternative really a difficulty alternative, or is that a third alternative?
I think it's actually, I was going to say it's a third alternative, because there is, so yeah, the key to kind of interpreting these patterns of activations to me is always relating them back to behavior, right? Are they helping you, or are they associated with either maintained, so for older adults, we're happy if we stay the same, but maintained or improved behavioral performance, or is it associated, or not at all related to behaviors, or is it associated with worse behavioral performance? So yeah, compensatory is not necessarily tied. Well, there's a third hypothesis that Michele mentioned, this crunch model, which suggests that whether you see compensatory or dedifferentiation response really depends on the level of task difficulty. That it may be the case that older adults do tend to kind of upregulate, and at lower levels of difficulty, they can really keep up with that, and it's really helpful. But then they are more sensitive to these increases in task demands, so they kind of are less able to keep up with it as younger adults might be able to. And so then at those harder levels of difficulty, where they're no longer able to really keep up with the task, then it kind of becomes a differentiation relationship. That's a great question. And I think that the jury's a little bit still out on that, but I'll tell you. So now I'll tell you a little bit about some studies that we've done over the last couple of years, and that get at these questions of what's the nature of these increases in activation. And we in our lab, we find evidence for both. I won't tell you more for one for the other, but so I'm interested in language production, and I'm interested in phonological, and we've been looking at this through phonological and semantic aspects of language production. We almost always use picture naming, either covert picture naming or overt picture naming. And this is because we want the older adults and the younger adults to generate the names themselves. If you give them just text to read and you're a skilled reader, the orthography gives you clues to the phonology. So it's kind of like giving you the answer almost. But in this first study that we did, we ended up using semantic judgments and phonological judgments, and also there was a perceptual control condition as well, where we gave participants a cue, and then they saw two pictures, and they had to answer, do both of those pictures match the cue? So it was kind of a semantically based or biased task, or a phonologically biased task. And in this case, it starts with L. So if both of these items started with L, they would press yes, and if they didn't, they would press no. And then there was this just kind of perceptual condition where they had to say same or different. So for behavioral performance, what we saw was a main effective age and a main effective condition. So older adults, not surprisingly, were a lot slower than younger adults. They were also less accurate than younger adults. That's pretty typical in terms of what you find. We also found, though, main effective condition in which everybody was a little bit slower on the phonological tasks, suggesting that it may have been a little bit more difficult than the semantic task. And also this interaction here between task, condition, and age group, in which older adults made more errors, but only on the phonological condition. So we wanted to look at kind of a measure of efficiency. It seemed like there were some speed accuracy trade-offs, so we also did a drift rate calculation, which is really just a measure of efficiency, in which higher values are associated with more efficient processing. And so it combines in both accuracy and reaction time as well. And in this case, we also saw an age by condition interaction, suggesting that older adults were less efficient when they were making phonological judgments, but not different from younger adults when they were making semantic judgments, which is consistent with this idea of semantic stability across the lifespan. What we saw in terms of neuroimaging results were main effects of conditions. So for the semantic condition, we saw activation in pretty typical semantic regions. It's more posterior and anterior temporal regions, but then also inferior frontal regions, which have had others have shown to have involvement in semantic selection, as well as a lot of other kind of both domain general and language specific executive aspects of language. And this block here of kind of dorsal medial prefrontal cortex or superior frontal cortex. For the phonological condition, we saw two regions we were not expecting. So one was this cingulate region, kind of more posterior cingulate, and then this precuneus region. Cingulate has a role, well-documented role in executive function, but also monitoring, so kind of paying attention to things. And precuneus is involved in a lot of retrieval mental imagery. So not necessarily phonological regions per se. Again, maybe suggesting that the phonological condition was had a little bit more perceptual monitoring demands to it. We did not see an age by condition interaction, but we did see main effects of age. So shown in blue here are the regions in which the older adults elicited more activation, and shown in orange are the regions in which the younger adults showed more activation. And so what you can see is consistent with what I was telling you before, is that older adults just activate more brain regions than younger adults. And in particular, those brain regions are really kind of distributed throughout the brain. There is not much specificity here in terms of where the older adults are upregulating, but the general trend is it tends to be more dorsal regions and also more frontal regions. Whereas the younger adults are activating more of these kind of perceptual visual processing regions, a little bit of anterior cingulate here as well, which is these are kind of, I would say, just general visual processing regions, and domain general kind of like executive task switching kinds of selection regions. But the key question in terms of interpreting these patterns of activation is how do they relate to behavior? And so we looked at drift rate in this case. So again, higher values are associated with higher efficiencies, better performance, and then numbers of voxels of activation just kind of collapsed across the brain regions for the phonological trials and the semantic trials. And what we saw for both cases is that younger adults had significant relationships between performance and activation. So there are the triangles here and the line here. So for the phonological condition, we see a positive correlation. More efficiency is associated with more engagement or more voxels of activation, and a trend in that direction for the semantic trials here. This is the younger adults. But for the older adults, who are the pretty flat lines, there really wasn't any relationship between their performance and how much the brain activated, which is more consistent with a de-differentiation account of kind of age-related differences in activation. So no evidence of compensation, although they were able to do the task, just not quite as fast and accurate as the younger adults. Oh, and the other thing I'll mention here too is that it was the case that they didn't show a significant relationship, a significant brain behavior relationship for either the semantic processing or the phonological processing. So it was not necessarily selective to the kind of task, but maybe more general characteristic of older adults.
Did you say was there more bilateral activation?
Yes. Yeah, and you can see that on this slide here. Although the younger adults do engage bilateral occipital regions, you can see the older adults, they have many more regions in both hemispheres. You can see it pretty well here. It's pretty, maybe a little bit more in the left frontal regions, but it's pretty evenly distributed across the hemispheres for the older adults. So as I mentioned before, there are multiple hypotheses about what's underlying these age-related differences in language production. And I should also say they're not mutually exclusive. Like, it could be the case that older adults do have less sensitivity to phonological processing and that they have inhibition deficits. And these two skill sets kind of combine to have a double impact on language production. But we wanted to look at this issue of task-irrelevant information a little bit more closely. So we did a second experiment, which was nearly identical to the first experiment, different groups of participants, so no overlap there. But they were making the same kind of phonological judgments, semantic judgments, and then perceptual judgments. They just had to decide if these two were the same or not. But what we wanted to give them was something that would, well, it was task-irrelevant information. And in this case, it was going to be either semantically related to one of the two items or phonologically related to one of the two items. So we wanted to make it phonological in nature or semantic in nature, but we also wanted to make it such that it didn't necessarily directly relate to the task that they were doing. So in this case, the phonologically related item rhymes with one of the two pictures, but it doesn't necessarily help them say if it starts with P. I mean, it may help them indirectly get from grant to plant to P, but it's not directly related to the cue. Similarly here, this is And so what we found in this experiment was a similar main effect of age group and a main effect of condition, a main effect for reaction time, a main effect of condition for accuracy. And here we looked at efficiency in terms of just RT divided by accuracy, which is another measure of efficiency. And here again, a main effect of age group, but not necessarily condition. So our condition by age group interaction went away in the second experiment. But if we compare the results to our first experiment, they're quite similar. So main effects, and also of note, not so different reaction times here. So the addition of this task irrelevant information didn't really qualitatively change their behavioral performance, other than this potential loss of interaction that we saw. But overall, pretty similar. For the, yes?
Just to clarify on that previous task, they weren't actually making a judgment on that middle line. Was it?
No. Nope. They were told you're going to see words or letter strings and just ignore them, right? To your best of your ability, just ignore them. Although, to be honest, we did present them, at fixation, and we presented them as text because we wanted them to be very salient. So our hope was kind of that they would process them. We're instructed to just not let that influence them. Extent they could. What we see for our patterns of brain activation, again, we saw main effect of condition, semantic. The semantic trial engaged anterior temporal regions to a greater extent, and the same inferior frontal region that I had talked about as being involved in semantic selection and also just executive processing in general. And similarly, we saw again this precuneus area and posterior cingulate engaged for the phonological condition. If we compare this to our previous results, you'll see it's quite similar. There were, comparing the two experiments between each other, there were no regions in which the second experiment had more activation than the first. In the semantic condition, and then in the phonological condition, this posterior cingulate area was a little bit larger in the second experiment than the first experiment, but overall, the results were quite similar. So no suggesting that this addition of task irrelevant information really didn't change their processing or their performance on the task very much at all. If we look at the age effects, again, we see a very similar patterns. The older adults are engaging, in blue here, are engaging these more dorsal and frontal regions to a greater extent than younger adults. And younger adults are engaging these lateral occipital regions more than older adults, suggesting that the younger adults may be relying a little bit more on basic perceptual processing than the older adults. If we look at how this brain activation relates to behavior, we see, again, a similar pattern of results. So here, sorry, this is right now, efficiency is plotted as reaction time, so higher reaction times are worse performance, and here we're using drift rate, so higher drift rates are more efficient. So those slopes are a little bit backwards, or the slopes are backwards, but they are trying to indicate the same thing. And what we see again is that for the younger adults presented in red here, we see a significant relationship between the amount of activation and reaction time, such that faster reaction times are associated with more voxels of activation, but with, and that is trending for the phonological condition and significant for the semantic condition, but no significant brain behavior relationship for the older adults, which is suggesting that, this upregulation that we're seeing is not benefiting them, at least in this covert production task that we came up with. So some interim conclusions. We saw some evidence of phonological decline with age in that the first experiment we had an age by condition interactions. Neurally, we see that the older adults engage more brain regions, typically dorsal and frontal regions, and that the brain behavior relations were only found for younger but not older adults. So this is theoretically consistent with the dedifferentiation account in terms of neural theories. I'd say it's partially consistent with the transmission deficit account, but the neuroimaging results really didn't converge as much in support of that as well. But no evidence that this additional information caused increased distraction, really. Their performance was quite similar across the two tasks for these two different groups of participants. So that's another thing to keep in mind. So any differences that we saw, they may just be kind of sampling differences. So we wanted to look at, but like I mentioned, there are multiple hypotheses about what might be underlying age-related differences in language production. And another hypothesis is this issue of task difficulty. And so we wanted to do another experiment that looked at picture naming and phonology in younger and older adults, but to try and manipulate the levels of difficulty. And so we went with the phonological go, no-go task, and they had 3 different conditions. The first couple of runs of the experiment were always what we called these all-go runs, where participants knew they were coming into to do an experiment. They knew they were going to be naming pictures. And so for the first 2 runs, we just said, okay, just, picture comes up, just name it, just say what it is. And after they were done with those 2 runs, then we told them about this go, no-go manipulation, where they now were instructed, so if a picture comes up and it starts with a consonant, then you name it. If it comes up and it starts with a vowel, then you don't name it. And this was our go bias run, where 75% of the trials were trials that you should name, and then 25% of the trials were trials that you should withhold naming. And we also had a no-go bias run where we reversed the instructions, where they were now to name the pictures if they started with a vowel, and not name the pictures if they started with a consonant. And we chose this manipulation both to focus them on the sounds of the words, but also it's very convenient. There are more consonants than vowels, so you could bias towards naming or against naming. And so in this way, we were able to kind of parametrically increase naming difficulty 100%, 75%, 25%. And at the same time that you're manipulating naming difficulty, you're also manipulating this inhibition difficulty as well, where in the no-go bias run, where they're 75% of the time they don't have to name, that's a lot easier than when they're having to only withhold their response on a minority of trials. Behaviorally, what we saw was a good evidence that our manipulation worked. There were these kind of linear increases in task difficulty or in reaction time as a function of conditions, so we interpret this as task difficulty increases. And importantly, on the all-go condition, the younger and older adults were the least different on that condition. They performed pretty similarly. But as the task difficulty increased, all the groups got slower, but the older adults got significantly more slower than the younger adults. So they were more affected by these increases in difficulty. We also looked at, as a measure of inhibition, our commission error rate. So the number of times that participants named the pictures that they weren't supposed to name. And here we see again a main effect of difficulty, where they have more commission error rates on the trial, on the runs where they are biased towards naming. And the main effect where older adults have more commission error rates than younger adults. So this might be a piece of evidence in favor of inhibition, right? So they are less effectively inhibiting their response when they're supposed to be. Although you'll see here from the numbers, these are very small numbers of errors that the group had overall. So overall doing well, but there was a significant increase in the number of commission errors for older adults. Oh, and I should also mention too that everybody saw the all-go runs first, but then we counterbalanced the order of whether they saw go bias or no-go bias across our participants. So there hopefully weren't any reliable effects of order in the results. So these are showing some of our results from just the all-go run, kind of pure picture naming. And what you see is picture naming is a very robust task. It engages a lot of brain regions for younger adults and for older adults. And you can also see that they activate or engage very similar brain regions, but that older adults tend to have this more higher levels of activation compared to younger adults. We can see that also in the significant differences. The younger adults had more activation, again, in posterior brain regions. So these are all primary visual regions, primary visual cortex, but then also basic visual processing regions like lateral occipital cortex and a little bit of posterior temporal. And then in the regions where older adults had more activation than younger adults, again, we see these really broad patterns of increases in activation that are mostly in dorsal and also frontal regions, but still, some in bilateral temporal areas. So really kind of throughout the brain, this kind of pattern of upregulation that you see. We see similar effects for the bias condition. So this is now collapsing across the go and the no-go runs for picture naming. And again, very similar patterns of activation for the younger and for the older adults, but the older adults have kind of more intense younger adults engage many more posterior brain regions, but here now also you can see a lot more engagement of anterior cingulate, which is a cognitive control region, whereas the older adults have this kind of pattern of dorsal frontal activation, where they have more activation than the younger adults. We also looked at the differences between changing from this kind of pure picture naming runs to the addition of tasks. So this is collapsing across both kinds of bias conditions. And what we see is that when younger adults have to move from picture naming, just general picture naming, to a go, no-go task, they tend to engage these right frontal regions here, but also basal ganglia. These are, again, not language-specific regions, but cognitive control regions. So suggesting that they are kind of effectively modulating with task demands. If you look at the older adults, there's really very few regions that are changing from the pure picture naming run to the task runs. And so that might be surprising given what I showed you. They have all this activation, but I think that's what's actually underlying this lack of difference here, is that they're even at the level of naming, they're already engaging so much of the brain that there is less room to go up from there. Now, if we dive down a little bit deeper and look at the difference between the go bias run and the no-go bias run, then we do see some differentiation. So it's not the case that older adults are not able to adjust at all to task demands. Here we see actually very similar patterns of upregulation for the younger adults, going from the go bias to the no-go bias, and for the older adults going for the go bias to the no-go bias. So what this suggests is that maybe there was very little difference between all naming and the go bias naming, but then once you had to upgrade to change to the only 25% naming condition, the no-go bias condition, then that's where the older adults kind of made their jump in terms of engaging even more brain regions.
So
Yeah.
I've lost track of one thing. So in one condition, they're using their mouths a lot more than the other, right? Are you only
Yes.
looking at one, like where they don't speak, or how are you dealing with the fact that there's activity related to motion?
Yeah. So so there's two questions there, and one is just how does motion affect the quality of the data? And so,
yeah, that was not my question.
Oh, okay. But then the other question is they're actually naming more things.
Yeah.
So or naming fewer things as they go on. So for AllGo, there are many more trials where they name, and then there's 75% of those trials, and then there's 25% of those trials. So in truth, we should actually be less powered to see the differences in the no-go bias run. So we're looking at just where they're naming the pictures.
Just where they
so
are.
Just the trials where they are naming the pictures. And so that kind of power issue where the number of trials changes kind of undercuts our ability to see increases in activation. But so the fact that we still see they have an increase really does suggest that the kind of change in terms of the percentages that you have to name is really kind of strongly affecting their performance. I think this is my bias. Okay, but so like I was saying before, though, the key is always trying to link these activation changes back to behavior in some way, shape, or form. And this is focusing on the older adults now, but we found similar patterns of activation for the younger adults. These are looking at, so for older adults who performed better, where did they also see increases in activation? And what we see is that when older adults were faster in terms of naming the pictures, the regions that they engaged were similar to the regions that the younger adults were engaging by and large. So these kind of posterior visual regions, but then also some motor regions as well. And this is from the AllGo condition, and this is from the bias condition. So the general patterns of activation are similar. This kind of increased recruitment of posterior regions, and then also some motor regions as well, and a little bit of insula, bilateral insula here too. So those were all regions that were supported, that were associated with better performance. We did also see the opposite. So regions where increases in activation were associated with slower performance or worse naming. And those regions were this right anterior temporal region right here, but then these dorsal and frontal regions. So a lot of this superior frontal activation was actually associated with worse performance instead of better performance. So some conclusions, behaviorally, we saw very similar performance during simple picture naming tasks. Older adults definitely seem to be more affected by task demands. And in terms of the fMRI activation, what we saw is older adults had a much higher level of baseline activation, and that the compensatory patterns we found were in really primary visual and primary motor regions. So when older adults could recruit these regions to a greater extent, they had better performance on the task. And really the frontal activations seem to be most closely tied to worse performance. So this kind of increased recruitment of frontal cortex, although initially seeming like it could be promising from the very early studies of aging, we don't see evidence for that, at least in terms of language production tasks.
Sorry.
Mhm.
One more question. So the correlations you showed us, are those across people or are they within person, good trials versus bad trials?
They're across people. So people who respond faster versus people who respond slower. Yeah, it's a good question. And then this experiment, I think, is partially consistent with the crunch model, where you see, oh, the one thing I didn't also mention is we looked at the strength of those correlations and whether the strength of correlations depended on task difficulty, and they did. We saw stronger correlations in the pure picture naming conditions compared to the go, no-go bias conditions. So I think that's partially consistent with the crunch model. So these, what we learned from our last study, well, one of the main findings was that older adults are more affected by task demand, and we're using these kind of very artificial, kind of lab-based tasks that are probably, not the most naturalistic tasks to use. And so we wanted to take a step back. We're still interested in these ideas of phonological and semantic processing, but we wanted to try and maybe minimize the task demands that we had on our participants. So in this last study, which we've only just finished data collection, so I just have some preliminary results to show you, we thought about doing more implicit phonological and semantic manipulations. So when participants come in, all they have to do are name the pictures. These are relatively common objects, and just come in, say deer, kite, and then we have these this perceptual and motor control condition where they just say picture, and then blueberry. But underneath, what we were manipulating were the phonological neighborhood densities and the semantic neighborhood densities of the items. And so you take an object like deer, this is a word that has both a large phonological neighborhood, so lots of words sound like ear, or have ear in them, and then also a large semantic neighborhood space, right? So there are lots of woodland animals that share a lot of semantic features with deer. And then you take something like kite, and that probably has a large phonological neighborhood, but maybe a little bit smaller semantic neighborhood. And then blueberry, blueberry technically, although there are lots of berries, it probably has fewer phonological neighborhoods that differ, fewer phonological neighbors that differ in just one phoneme, but a large semantic neighborhood. So we parametrically manipulated these characteristics. And then the other thing that we wanted to change is to sample a greater segment of the population. So before we had been comparing younger adults, 18 to 35 or 18 to 30, and older adults 60 to 80. Here we wanted to sample kind of across the lifespan. So we've recruited 91 participants, and they're roughly a few more females than males, and a few more older, a few more on the extremes. These middle-aged people are we're very busy people. They don't like to come into the lab, or they are some of the most unreliable, I'll say. Their kids get sick, they have to work, schedules change. So, yeah. But so this is just some preliminary data. What we see for reaction time is what we expected. That phonological neighborhood density increases would be associated with faster response time. So in terms of language production, although the data is a little bit mixed on this, in general, larger phonological neighborhoods are thought to help production. They kind of help you have lots of neighbors, lots of similar sounding words. It's easier to get those words out. And that's what we see here in terms of reaction time, and also in terms of accuracy, so higher accuracies for larger phonological neighborhoods. On the other hand, for semantic neighborhoods, generally, if you have more larger semantic neighborhoods, you may have more competitors. Although it can depend on exactly the characteristics of those neighbors and how close, similar, or distant they are from you. But we see a significant effect on reaction time, where larger semantic neighborhoods are associated with significantly longer reaction times. Although here, what I'm plotting here is the raw data, and then the significance effects are from the models that control for phonological neighborhood density and frequency effects, a host of other factors. So the lines may not relate to the p-value. So again, this is accuracy, but once we control for the other factors, we actually don't see a significant effect of semantic neighborhood density on accuracy. If we look at our reaction time and age effects, we actually don't see a main effect of age. It's fairly linear across the lifespan in terms of their reaction times. Although we do see a significant effect of accuracy, where older adults are a little bit less accurate than younger adults in terms of picture naming. So looking at some of our preliminary MRI results, for picture naming, just basic picture naming, we see this traditional left hemisphere language network with left inferior frontal regions, left pre and post central motor regions, and also some superior temporal gyrus and posterior temporal regions involved. That's just consistent with what others have found. If we look at the age effects, where do older adults, or where are increases in age correlated with increases in activation, we see these large increases in superior and middle temporal gyrus here, and also some post-central gyrus regions, as well as some of these frontal regions that tended to be not so helpful in our last experiment. As far as phonological neighborhood density, where do we see the effects? This is showing negative correlations. So where declines in phonological neighborhood density are associated with increases in activation. So as the phonological neighborhood gets more sparse, what brain regions do you see that are engaging more? And although there are some visual regions here, the main region that we're interested in here is this superior temporal gyrus bilaterally that we see increased engagement of. And if we look at age effects, so where do these effects get stronger with age? We see this similar but much smaller region of superior temporal gyrus here in the right and the left hemisphere, as well as perhaps some premotor, whether that's post-central gyrus activation. So suggesting that as you get older, these kind of basic motor and perceptual regions are having to engage more. We also saw both positive, and we didn't see any positive correlations for phonological neighborhood density. So as phonological neighborhoods got larger, we didn't see any areas of increased activation. For the semantic neighborhood effects, we saw both positive and negative correlations. So as semantic neighborhoods got larger, we see this bilateral, kind of lateral occipital, very posterior temporal recruitment. And as semantic neighborhoods get smaller or sparser, we saw increased involvement in this similar, well, it's a little bit more anterior, it's more orbital frontal, but left inferior frontal region here, and also posterior middle temporal gyrus, as well as this kind of superior middle frontal gyrus activation. So more reliance on kind of semantic regions and maybe some executive control regions as the semantic neighborhoods are getting.
I took a verbal this morning. Sorry. Did you control? Do you know whether some like semantic properties are controlled with semantic neighborhood? So, for example, are large neighborhoods more visual, for example?
Well, all of our items are visual for that, so that's for sure.
So, yes, yeah.
Yeah, I mean we're doing picture naming, so.
So, for example, our tools tend to be small neighborhoods and animals large neighborhoods, right? For example.
Well, I don't know if tools would be a smaller neighborhood than animals necessarily.
Yeah, I don't know either.
Yeah.
But there's clearly semantic differences in those two categories. That's just.
Yeah. Yes, there are. And we did not look at the feature level of, in terms of like characteristics of the neighborhoods, just simply size of the neighborhood. Okay. And then, so as far as the semantic effects in terms of their correlations with age, we found significant age correlations only for the negative semantic correlation. So as semantic neighborhoods get smaller, older adults tend to recruit more of these right middle frontal regions. and a little bit of left superior temporal gyrus, but suggesting again that their older adults are relying more on these, what we would call domain general control regions to help with the recall of words that have maybe a less rich semantic neighborhood. So just some interim conclusions. We saw age effects in terms of naming. We saw positive correlations between fMRI activation and age. Just as you get older, you tend to recruit more brain regions. But we also saw age effects for the phonological characteristics. So a greater sensitivity to smaller phonological neighborhoods in bilateral superior frontal gyrus, and a greater sensitivity for smaller semantic neighborhoods in right middle frontal gyrus. So the big question that we're looking into now, and I don't have the answer for, is how do these effects relate to behavior? So that, I think, is going to be the million-dollar question in terms of what these actually mean. And so we'll see. Hopefully I have more by Society for Neurobiology of Language meeting. In kind of overall conclusions, we do see some evidence supporting phonological decline in naming. So there was worse performance behaviorally on phonological tasks. Additional salient information didn't seem to have that dramatic of an effect on older adults naming. And we also saw age-related sensitivity to phonological characteristics in superior temporal regions, even in the context of minimal task demands. So these, I think, we can't really attribute to just artificial, really problematic, potentially problematic tasks. But as I mentioned, there were also age-related differences in semantics, and those differences tended to be in control regions. So I think we see a combination of both decline in phonological sensitivity, but also in terms of cognitive control as it relates to even basic language production. For our age effects, like we were talking about before, we see larger behavioral affective task demands. So this is kind of something that at least I'm trying to keep in mind now with all of our experiments moving forward, is that older adults, even though they can do the task, they may be a lot more sensitive to it neurally in terms of what we're going to see in brain activation. I would say much more common in our results was this evidence in favor of dedifferentiation. We did see some compensatory patterns in our go, no-go task in which premotor regions and some of the temporal regions were associated with better performance, but more often we saw a lot of lack of relationship between the brain and behavior. And so then the one takeaway that I was mentioning before, task difficulty might be really a driving factor in terms of determining whether you're going to see compensatory or differentiation patterns. And for my last slide, I'd just like to thank everybody in the lab, my funding sources and my collaborators, and all the many, many, many students who helped in one way or another. This research really, and I think everybody's research really would be not without graduate students and undergraduates. So thank you very much for your attention.
Yes, I was wondering if especially for the go no go task, if you looked at some sort of a learning effect over time, especially for the older adults. Maybe they didn't do so well in the beginning and their averages overall, but maybe by the end
they were really good. Yeah. Well, I don't think we looked at that in terms of performance necessarily, but we did look at whether or not the ordering mattered for the go bias, like whether the go bias came first or the no go bias came first, and we didn't see any differences there because there was a concern that you give them one set of instructions and then you kind of reverse it on them in the second half of it, because once they're naming for consonants and then they're not naming for consonants, and was that somehow a challenge for them more so than younger adults, and we didn't see any effects there. But we could, I don't remember if we looked at the behavioral effects for that. Because there is, with all these tests, we try and train them on, well, although
there's a training period.
Well, not for the go, no-go task, because that one we didn't want them to be biased by task constraints in their first naming run. So that is a good question. Yeah,
with good clinical applications.
yes.
My question has to do with one of the very first slides where you're showing older adults have declined most of their abilities, but their semantic knowledge is improving. And I was wondering if you think it's worth pursuing to maybe control for individuals' lexical knowledge, regardless of their age and compare how their behavior will be based on their lexical knowledge. It's maybe this interaction with age as well, because I was thinking, what if a lot of the problems, wordful problem, has to do with just much richer semantic networks, and there's just a lot of competition going on.
Yes.
And also I think this also has to do with some bilingual research, where bilinguals like us have lots of problems retrieving words either in a non-native language or even in our native language. And I think just because our lexicons are just too big. I don't know.
Yeah, it's a really interesting question, because I do think there is a lot of heterogeneity in terms of what our semantic systems might look like, and I don't know that anyone's really looked at this kind of individual differences. So right now we use the WAIS vocabulary measure for vocabulary, and it's got, I mean, I think it's a good general indicator of vocabulary, but I don't think it gets at that question exactly like you would need to.
Have you heard of this naming task that's abbreviated as MINT, like bilingual picture naming task? It's developed by Dr. Yeah, and I've actually done some of that in Chinese, although like some of the items we can talk about it are not suited for Chinese per se, but I think it's it's being used pretty widely to compare like lexicon size across.
Oh yeah. So there actually have been a couple of papers that have come out by, I think his first name's Paul, but his last name's Hoffman, that have looked at this issue of semantics and naming ability. And his idea is that it's semantic selection ability, but the idea is very much like what you're saying, that the idea that older adults know more words, they know a lot more features, you know, their knowledge itself is richer, and so this does present a selection challenge. And that he finds a lot of naming difficulty is coherence too. Coherence in discourse is related to this semantic selection. So yeah, I think it's a really interesting idea, and I don't know that anyone's really been looking at these semantic networks on an individual level. Like the idea that we might all just have a little bit different lexicon, a little bit different.
And a question sort of related to Monica's. Towards the end of your talk, you talked about LIFG results and the sparseness of the semantic network.
Yeah.
And sort of contrary to predictions where LIFG activation would increase in the size of the semantic network because there's more competition.
Yeah.
We found that it increased with
less.
Yeah. How do you interpret that?
Yeah, well, I think it is a challenge to interpret. I totally agree, because you're right. I think in general, so the idea is that you have more options, then that's going to be one kind of selection challenge. I mean, that's not what we found. So, I mean, you know, I can just kind of speculate a little bit that there might also be a challenge if you have really impoverished semantic networks too. So getting at that item is not hard because you have a lot of competitors, but it might be hard because it's just kind of like a semantic island in some ways. There are some interesting models about how, you know, how neighbors might affect things, right? And so in some ways they're potential competitors, but in other ways, I think, you know, if you had a case where you had a really high frequency item, then with a lot of semantic neighbors that were kind of low frequency items, that might actually end up helping you. So I think the influence of neighbors, especially for the semantics, can be multifaceted.
And do you think there is like further specialization within LIFG, or like some areas would be more sensitive?
Yeah, so that's another real area of controversy in terms of whether LIFG is domain specific or domain general. So Sharon Thompson-Schill and Ed Fedorenko, I think, have done a lot of work on this. And, you know, so these really elaborate mapping tasks where you kind of map out in a single individual what is LIFG responsive to. And I think there's such interesting work, but it takes forever, right, to do these kind of mapping. So I think most people just don't do it. And then what we get is the average. And I think if you look at the results in general for left inferior femoral gyrus, kind of like just across the literature, it's sensitive to a lot of different things. It's not specific to semantic selection, although it certainly responds to that too. But it's sensitive to a lot of these executive kind of aspects of both language and kind of domain general things.
It has been a prominent area like in our research. I told you with tracking objects.
Yes, Yeah, yeah. And if you've ever seen these, like, I think Sharon Thompson, Michelle, and Federico have these papers that they show some maps, individual maps, and they're really seem to be kind of like intertwined with these areas that are specifically responsive to semantic executive function versus kind of domain general executive function. So I think it's going to be challenging to kind of piece this apart. Yes.
Just a basic question. I'm really familiar with the picture naming test. This has to do with phonological structure, though. So do you see effects of number of syllables for words, even syllable structure, especially for English, because you have like very complex onsets and stuff like that. I just wonder if that affects how people treat words.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it does. I mean, so one of it's not the research that I presented here, but one of the other things that we're looking at are different kinds of neighbors. So like whether you have a minimal pair or not. So if you're a member of kind of like a minimal pair. And I think those effects are much stronger if the overlap or the differentiation is on the first syllable as compared to like all the other syllables. I don't know the literature so well on different kinds of first syllables, you know, so if plosives are easier to differentiate than some other kind of onset. But yes, I think position definitely makes a difference in terms of where in the word. And then also the other side of that too is that length of the word will also influence how many neighbors you have. So the way that neighbors are typically defined is differ by one phoneme. And so if you're a CVC kind of word, you're going to have lots of neighbors. If you're blueberry, even though there's raspberry, cranberry, boysenberry, technically you have many fewer neighbors because those differ by many more than just one phoneme. So yeah, a challenge. But I think one of the things I like about the experiment that we've just finished is that we're trying to make it as natural as possible. So we include this kind of diverse kinds of stimuli. So we're not limiting it to just kind of CVC words. They are all imageable imageable items because we're doing picture naming, but we try and have some diversity in terms of the length, frequency, name agreement, things like that. Yeah.
So following from that, when you showed the scatter plot with phonological neighborhood density, so first of all, are you doing deletion, addition, substitution neighbors? Okay.
Yeah.
So you said the plot was labeled centered phonological density, but it seemed very asymmetrical.
Yeah.
To a surprising degree. So I was curious about that. And I'm also curious about what do you do with zeros, like blueberry, right? So you're gonna have a whole bunch of items that just don't really have much predictive value.
Yeah, well, so right now we model them linearly on, you know, as kind of a covariate in the MRI model. So just kind of, you know, wherever they stand, that's kind of what we're tracking. So seeing if the hemodynamic response is sensitive to this variability in terms of the neighborhood size. I think you're right in the sense that we are going to have items that have very small neighbor to no neighbors.
Blueberry has 0.
Yeah.
For sure. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, and I think so that's kind of one end of the spectrum that we're looking at.
Okay. I mean, I think there's a problem with thinking about lexical dimensions like that is that you know that definition of neighborhood not suited for anything besides monosyllabic words, really, right? And it's a puzzle that I think we all face and have to struggle with to come up with a better way of considering similarity for longer words.
Yeah.
And can I ask, what was your measure of semantic neighborhood density?
So we use ChemicRay's database in terms of feature overlap and with cosine similarity.
So you just summed up the cosine similarity from one word to every other word, and that is like 547 words.
Right, exactly.
Okay. Oh, okay. Thanks. Good.
So you showed us these, you know, this overarching picture that older adults are activating more. Your take is broadly it's probably dedifferentiation in most cases. But I'm curious about laterality differences. So one thing to activate more stuff, but whether it's more weighted to sort of language specific or in general specialties. Do you see those lateralities changing as well over the course of aging? And are they related to better or worse performance?
Right, so if you have increases in activation, but they tend to be left lateralized, would that be better for you then? So we haven't looked at the granularity of that data across the lifespan yet. Say what we see for the older adults is pretty bilateral. So it's not, we have not looked at, so is overactivation in left hemisphere maybe potentially better for you than overactivation in right hemisphere? No, that's a really interesting question. And I think it may also relate to why, so like a lot of areas of research, so like say episodic memory, find these increases in activation in prefrontal regions are beneficial. And maybe that's the case for these other areas of cognition because they are left lateral. They are less lateralized than say language. Whereas language really is a, you know, it's a very kind of compact network. Not that the right hemisphere doesn't do anything for language, but I think just generic activation in the right hemisphere may be less suited to language than say other domains. So yeah, we haven't looked at that for the middle-aged group to see if the patterns of overactivation change across the lifespan, but I think that's a great question.
So the comparison of old versus young, right? So how do we deal, or is it known that these effects aren't due to cardiovascular differences or just sort of some bold difference that has nothing to do with cognition, right? Just,
yeah. Well, no, so that is another possibility. Yeah, and we do know that older adults tend to have more vascular changes than younger adults. I'll say this is a pretty healthy sample in the sense that we screen out for anybody who has any kind of major medical issues or any kind of uncontrolled high blood pressure. But it is still possible that, I mean, we know that there's vascular changes across the lifespan. Blood vessels become less elastic and things like that. So that is another possibility.
But wouldn't that just slow down the hemodynamic response?
well, I could do all kinds of things.
But
I don't know. That's
not
like,
necessarily change
that's sort of my
activation.
question. Well,
Not levels, they're not changing.
well, who knows, right? I mean, if the baseline is lower in older people, right, then they start thinking it goes up more because there's more. So the signal looks bigger because we're doing the difference, right? I'm just totally making it up, right?
Yeah.
But the question is just sort of like, you know, I imagine that somebody has looked at the, you know, that you try to kind of, the field is trying to wrestle with that possibility.
Yeah, some of the earlier studies that looked at age differences and just kind of like basic visual processing tend to find that older adults elicit less activation than younger adults. These were studies that were done with like, you know, flash and check reports, so like the most basic kind of study. And I'll say that that's typically not what we see, right? We typically see larger patterns of activation for older adults. So what you really need to do is an ASL sequence, so arterial spin labeling, and it gets at something that looks at perfusion, because that's the kind of basis for the MRI signal, is how well is your vascular system delivering blood. And we didn't do that in this study, and you know, most people don't, just because you have, you know, this kind of precious hour of time and you've got to decide what you spend your time on. But I think it's a valid question to think about. You know, what are the potential perfusion differences in the sample and others?
I was gonna ask an ASL question as well, but it seems like people haven't done it.
We no, we have one group who's doing it, and they're actually doing all structural imaging. Anyways, they're the TBI research group, so I think they are really interested in. They really hypothesize there could be larger perfusion difference in patients versus healthy people, but nobody else at our center is doing ASL.
People putting them in both MRI or
No. We don't do any PET scanning. We don't have a PET scanner in our facility. So probably they have one at Hershey, but that's where our medical school is, but it's 90 minutes away. So. Yeah, that'd be another kind of quick proxy, right?
All right, well, let's thank Michele.